Hey guys, welcome back to Reserved Investments on YouTube. So a lot of people are asking me, Sean, where do you see some of the hottest collecting markets going over the next 5, 10, 15 years, and what trends are you seeing now? And I always want to say, you know what, I'm going to answer this on camera, but usually I never get a chance to do this type of video. So what I want to do is I want to do a series of videos that look at the most popular collecting categories at present time, and we analyze the market. We look out the trends in those particular collecting categories. I tell you my thoughts on the market and also where the market's going short-term and or long-term. So what I'm going to look at right now in this video is the market for vintage comic books. Vintage comic books are an interesting collectible at present time because the market is very speculative right now. Now, make no mistake, the vintage comic book market is established. It is not like Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, or vintage video games, where those markets are completely new, speculative, and unestablished. The market for vintage comic books is extremely established because people have been collecting them for decades or more. We can go all the way back to the 1960s, and people were literally collecting comic books. Ironically, in 1970, the first major price guide for collecting comic books, known as the Overstreet Price Guide, was first published. When that book hit, it reignited interest in that market, and speculation was on top again. That's why a lot of books that were published from the 1970s and later are so easily available in high grade, because already at that point, the market was becoming established, and collectors went after a lot of present-day issues, which back in the 1970s would be your Tomb of Dracula 10, some of the more popular superhero comics like Giant Size X-Men 1, X-Men 94, Incredible Hulk 180, Incredible Hulk 181. They were hoarded in mass. A lot of people who are coming into this market don't realize that you really have to be careful if you're investing in Bronze Age, Copper Age, or Modern Era comics because they were hoarded. There's a lot of comic books from the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, and present day that are readily available in near mint condition. If you don't believe me, look up the population reports for Amazing Spider-Man 300. Even in 9.8 condition, that book is anything but rare. There are thousands of copies out there, all graded 9.8 condition. It is not, in my opinion, a good investment grade book, just due to that reason alone. So let's analyze this market. First, what trends are we seeing that's affecting the vintage comic book marketplace at present time? Well, there's one interesting trend that's developing that I really want to talk about, and that's the trend where a lot of well-to-do, already established vintage comic book collectors are cashing out their holdings, and they're starting to go after graded WATA video games. There seems to be a crossover effect with comic book collectors and vintage video game collectors, and it's really fueling interest in WATA-graded video games at present time. That's one of the facets of that market. Now, how is this affecting the vintage comic book market? Well, what you have to understand is if this trend continues, there's going to be a lot of people that are cashing out their vintage comic book collections, and that supply is going to hit the market. Without new collectors coming in to buy up that supply, prices are going to either start to stabilize or drop overall. I predict over the next 5 to 10 years, the vintage comic book marketplace is going to hit a 10 to 20% downturn on average, and it's going to affect all books, key or not. It's not going to matter. So you have to be very careful if you are operating in the vintage comic book marketplace at present time, because believe it or not, no asset class can go up exponentially long term. And over the last 10, 15, 20 years, that's what's been happening with vintage comic books. You know, guys, there was a time in the 1990s when even keys like Amazing Fantasy 15, Tales of Suspense 39, even Action Comics 1 were pretty much trending down in price. Now, there was no third-party grading at that time. There was no Marvel Cinematic Universe at that time. But comic books, at one point, were not always seen as a surefire investment like they are today. It's not to say the market's not established. It's just to say a correction in that market is long overdue. So what trends am I seeing in the vintage comic book marketplace at present time? Well, there's several that are appearing that we got to talk about. First, if you're investing in vintage comic books, do yourself a favor and avoid Western comic books, avoid Dells, avoid Disney comic books overall as well. Another category of the market that seems to be stabilizing and softening is the market for pre-code horror comic books. Now, this market is pretty much cooling off because a lot of the younger collectors that would gravitate towards this segment of the market are pretty much happy getting the anthology series of a lot of the EC comics like Tales of the Crypt or Volta Horror that have been published many different times in many different formats over the years, rather than buying the original comic books in high grade. I see that trend continuing. So be very careful if you are investing long-term in pre-code horror comic books. It's probably not going to work out in your favor, with few exceptions. If you have a key issue, if you have something that is truly scarce in high grade, that may be the exception to the rule. But overall, I would not advise people to invest in pre-code horror comic books on average at present time. They're a step above your Westerns, your Dells, and your Disneys. And yes, I know people will take issue with that, but that trend is developing, and it's there if you do a price history of most of these books. Second thing I want to talk about is be very careful if you're going after lesser known first appearance comic book characters that basically rose to prominence only because of movies that appeared in the Marvel Cinematic Universe or the DC Cinematic Universe. So for instance, I would not be investing long-term in books like the first appearance of Rocket Raccoon, or the first appearance of Groot, or even the first appearance of Ms. Marvel or Captain America. Most of those books are pretty much speculative based on the popularity of the movies and or movie franchises that propelled those books to new heights. The same thing is true, as I said already. Be very careful if you're going after the true key issues that are readily available. Your Amazing Spider-Man 300s, your giant-sized X-Men 1s, your X-Men 94s. Those books are out there and readily available for anybody who wants to buy them. You cannot compare a book like X-Men 94 to Action Comics 1 because there's only a handful of known issues of Action Comics 1 in any grade. Where if you want to buy a book like X-Men 94, you can get it in near mint plus, 9.8 condition, 9.2 condition. I can call 10 dealers, and chances are 8 out of those 10 dealers will have that book in stock in almost any grade I want it. That book is not rare. It is not a good investment overall. Be careful if you are heavily involved in that subset of the market. You know, there's a lot of times where collectors get obsessed with price memory. And they look at a book like Giant Size X-Men 1. I'm just going to pull a number out of the sky here. Let's say a 9.6 copy of Giant Size X-Men 1 is selling for $2,800 or $3,000 at present time. And maybe it's a little bit more. Maybe it's $3,200 at present time. Let's just use $3,000 and take the average and say that's what a Giant Size X-Men 1 in CGC 9.6 condition is. Well, in their minds, they automatically assume that no matter what, that book's worth $3,000. That is a fallacy. Be very careful if you have that mindset, because what's going to happen, either the price of that book is going to experience a correction, or the market's going to fall overall for vintage comic books, and that 9.6 copy of Giant Size X-Men 1 is going to fall to $2,000, or maybe even $2,500. Well, that collector has it in his head, that's a $3,000 comic book. Well, if he owns that book, he just lost $500 to $1,000 because the book went from $3,000 to $2,000 or $2,500. If he doesn't own that book and his mindset is that's a $3,000 book, if he goes to the marketplace and he wins the bid for $2,400, let's say, for that book, he thinks he got a great deal, when in reality, the market price of that book is only $2,400. So you really have to be cautious of markets like this, because the only constant in the antiques and collectibles trade is change. You know, a lot of you guys ask me, Sean, you need to do more videos on long-term storage of collectibles. You need to talk more about the use of safety deposit boxes, of off-site storage, some of these other long-term storage facilities, or even storing this stuff in a safe in your house. And I tell people those videos are coming. But one thing you got to understand, a lot of the markets that a lot of you guys are investing in out there in the collectibles marketplace are really not meant for long-term investing. I don't consider most comic books a good long-term investment in the antiques and collectibles trade. I don't consider Pokemon or video games good long-term investments in the antiques and collectibles trade. I've said this before. If you want to invest long-term in a lot of these markets, you better learn sophisticated antique markets like coins, currency, weapons, firearms, collectible first edition books, art, important historical documents, items of that nature, because they are more geared towards long-term investing. And ironically, most of those markets are considered quote-unquote boring by the average speculator out there. Well, the reason why they're boring is because they're sophisticated and established. You go out and you buy an original copy of, or first printing of The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, you better believe that's an investment-grade collectible. You can put that in a safety deposit box if you know what you're doing, store it for 50 years, pull it out in 50 years, guarantee you it'll probably sell for a higher price than what you paid for it today. I'm not saying you're going to make more than inflation. I'm not saying it's going to be the best investment ever, but that is an investment-grade item in the antiques and collectibles trade. And I guarantee if I mention that in this video, people in the comment section will say, well, Sean, that's boring. I don't want to do that. Well, you don't have to. That's fine. But just understand, if you're going in the vintage comic books, if you're going in the Pokemon, Magic the Gathering, great at video games, all those markets are speculative. They're not really meant, as of yet, for long-term investing. Just like I would not be paying at present time $3 million for a 9.0 copy of Action Comics 1. It's not something I deem as a great investment long-term. It's something I think is very overhyped and very over-speculated on at present time. Is that comic book really worth $3 million? Where are we getting these numbers? Simply because one sold at that condition for that price? This is something you have to ponder if you're choosing to put your money in these markets. Another mistake I think that people are making with vintage comic books especially is they're looking at books that are selling for $100,000, $500,000, $1 million or more, and they're thinking that that market equates to their copy of Incredible Hulk 181 in CGC 8.5 condition. I'm sorry. When you're talking about the top 1 to 3% of the market, that never ever serves as a barometer for the rest of the market as a whole. That is a fallacy. I said this a lot in my earlier videos, and I got away from this talking point. I want to bring it back because I have a lot of new subscribers. You cannot compare the top 1 to 3% of any collecting category, or any market for that matter, and think it represents the market as a whole. Most speculators, even most investors, I'm sorry to say, they're on the mid to the bottom tier of any collecting category. And even if you're paying $5,000 to $10,000 per comic book in the vintage comic book marketplace, believe it or not, you're really not still in the top tier of that collecting category. Same thing's true with coins. I love collecting coins. When I spend $5,000 on a coin or $10,000 on a banknote, those items, yeah, they're investment grade, but I'm by no means at the top tier of the trade where people are spending $100,000, $500,000 on one item. So you have to take all this into account, have a written plan, understand the market, and really analyze how long you want to hold these items, what you want to do with them, and what's your long-term and short-term goals. And this is something that most collectors, most speculators, and most investors do not do, and that's simply why they fail. If they would take the time to write in a piece of paper what items they want to buy, how much those items are going for, and what they think they're going to do with them when they get them, and how long they're going to hold them, and what price point they think they're going to sell them at, once you start writing that down, you're going to see how ridiculous it sounds to buy a comic book that just 5 years ago was selling for $500, that is now selling for $2,000. You're going to put $2,000 into that comic book, and you're going to write in a piece of paper, well, I'm going to sell it when it goes to $4,000. Well, where's the fundamentals that you're using that's going to cause that comic book that just went from $500, to use this as an example, to $2,000, it's now going to go to $4,000? Do you see how stupid that sounds? When you put that on paper, things become more clear. You analyze different. You look at the market from a different standpoint. Here's another tip for you guys, now that we're almost at the end of this video. use GP analysis. If you're investing in comic books or you're speculating in comic books, chances are you're going after graded comic books anyway. Get a subscription to GPA analysis for like $10 a month or $11, whatever it is, and use it. You can go back and you can look at what the prices of these comic books were selling for from several years from today. So you can go back 5 years in some cases, maybe even more, on a book like Amazing Spider-Man 300 or Giant Size X-Men 1. And you can see what prices it sold at various grades throughout that time period. That's how you analyze these markets. GP analysis makes it very easy. And to answer your next question, no, I'm not sponsored by them. I just happen to be a subscriber who uses their feedback and data from time to time because I have clients that come to me and want me to analyze this market. And I tell them, hey, I can save you a lot of money. Do your own research and get a subscription to GP analysis. And you'll have all the answers you need. If you can't afford a subscription to GP analysis, go on Heritage Auctions and simply register an account for free and look up completed auction histories. You can do the same thing, I believe, on Comic Link as well, which are both great companies to work with. That's all I got in this video. I hope it helped you guys. If it didn't, please let me know in the comment section. If it did, please consider liking and subscribing this video. The next topic we're going to talk about are other, more established collecting categories where I give my take on the market as a whole. So please stay tuned to this channel for all the latest news on a lot of the popular collecting categories out there, whether it be Pokemon, Magic the Gathering, video games, vintage toys, coins, currency, firearms, whatever you're into, chances are I cover it on this channel right here. Thank you guys. Have a great night.